Good evening, everyone. Thank you for making the time to join us all this evening for this Unbound conversation about Unbound Shakthi. My name is Priyanka, and I will be your moderator today. I will just take you through some quick housekeeping things before I hand over to our panelists. The chat feature will not be moderated for this webinar, but you're welcome to ask us any questions that you may have through the Q&A feature. That's a part of the Zoom chat. You can also, I will be asking questions in about an hour's time from now. We were also advised that there is a possibility of some internet outages today. So if the webinar is disrupted and we drop out, please try and sign back in, and we will be trying that from our end as well. If that is not possible, we will try and reschedule the webinar, but let's just hope the planets and the goddess is watching over us today. Without taking any more time, I will introduce you to our panelists, Padma Menon, whom you all know, and Sean Perera. You already have their bios, so I will be brief in my introductions. So Padma, as you all know, is a dancer and philosopher who is a pioneer in reviving the ancient practice of dance as a goddess wisdom tradition. She has been teaching for nearly 4 decades and currently runs Moving Archetypes, through which she works with women from all over the world via online programs. So please join me in welcoming Padma. Welcome, Padma.
Welcome. Thank you, Priyanka. Thank you so much for your welcome, and welcome everybody. I'm so delighted and honored that you will join us wherever you are, if you're watching this live with us or whether you're going to be watching the recording. From my heart, welcome all of you.
Thank you, Padma. It's always a delight to be in your presence. And to joining Padma on this panel is Sean Perera. Sean holds a PhD in science communication from ANU and researches how people communicate across cultural barriers. He has an abiding interest in Indian philosophy and traditions. So please join me in welcoming Sean.
Welcome. Thank you, Priyanka. Thank you for the introduction. Thank you, Padma, for having me, and welcome everyone.
Welcome, Sean.
Thank you.
Thank you both. I'm looking forward to this very interesting and insightful discussion today. And I will now hand over to the both of you.
Thanks, Priyanka, and thank you so much for being our moderator. Priyanka is a one of those inspiring young women in her own right. So very privileged and honored to have you moderating this event for us. I would like once again to welcome everybody here live, or if you're watching this recording. In the practice, there is something we say, which is Sahridaya, together in the heart space. And this is always the goddess space that we get together in the heart space. And so Sahridayas, I welcome all of you. And my invitation to you is to listen from your heart. Talking about an embodied tradition, a dance tradition, is always something that's a challenging thing to do, but we live in a reality where word talk is important. So we do our best when we talk about it. But my invitation is to listen from the heart, from your body. It's not going to be much for the mind to make sense and understand, but everything for you to feel. So, that's my invitation to you. One little thing I'd like to do, just for us to get into our bodies before we start, is a very simple practice. So please join me in this very simple practice. So wherever, I'm assuming that you're all sitting and listening. So wherever you're sitting, however you're sitting, I'm just going to invite you to drop your feet into the floor so that your feet are actually on the floor, both feet on the floor. Open your feet to the floor and then drop your weight into your sitting bones. So you've got your weight in your sitting bones and your weight through the feet in the floor. Bring your chin down so it's not hanging out of your body. We do so much work on computers these days that this is a very different consciousness when you hold your head like this. So bringing that chin, retreating, just dropping that chin down. Open your heart. So just lift and spread your heart. Open your palms. Just lay them on your lap. You don't need to close your eyes. The goddess loves the senses. So she wants you to enjoy everything that she has manifested. So just keep the eyes open and bring your attention to the feet, the weight through the feet, really as if you are tenderly pressing into the earth through the feet. The weight in your sitting bones, the hips, chin down. And just for a few seconds, think of your feet as the most important part of your body. Put your attention in the feet. Soften, open the feet. Be very tender with how the feet are in the earth. I said in the earth. That is what it is. We are sinking into the earth. We're not stamping on top of the earth. We are allowing ourselves to sink into the earth. And just a couple of deep breaths. And you can move your fingers and your feet, your toes. And now we're ready to do the talking. Before I give over to Sean, I just want to say a little bit about what is this goddess wisdom tradition that we will be talking about. The goddess wisdom tradition from my culture, where I was born and raised in India. So from my culture, this tradition dates back at least 5,000 years or even more, but we have artifacts that date back to at least 5,000 years. Some of these have been found in, for example, in Indus Valley, which is the Indus Valley Harappa civilization. So some of the excavations and the archaeological sites there have found some of these artifacts. The dance tradition itself is found in the book called Natya Shastra, which is an ancient text, about 250 BCE, so at least 3,000 years old. But of course, the practice is older than that. So the text was talking about a practice that already existed. But many of you may already know that in many different parts of the world, there have been traditions which are goddess-centered. There are traditions where goddess is the divine, is the source, and they all were around about the same time, earlier than that, in different parts of the world. And we also know that around the same time across the world, the consciousness changed and there was a movement towards much more what we call now in our language today, the patriarchal consciousness, which is really, in terms of this tradition, the consciousness that is sourced from the mind, that the mind dominates. So this shift happened. And so many of these goddesses who were very important deities or worshipped as the divine, as the goddess, they became kind of subsumed into these other religions. They became consorts in the culture, in Indian culture. Many of them became consorts. In other words, she was a bit tamed. And this is something hopefully we will talk about. So that is a little bit, just a very quick background. And this dance tradition, I had the good fortune of studying with people that came from very long lineages. My own teacher was a 10th or 11th generation dancer in his family. So they had this inherited lineage of this practice. And so the tradition is again very old, and it has been carried on by people in India for a very long time. So I'm going to stop talking. I feel like I've been talking a lot, and I'm going to hand over to Sean.
Thank you, Padma. It's always a pleasure to hear from you and hear you speak. And I have had the good fortune of attending your classes and the practice that you just initiated or shared with us at the beginning about focusing and moving our energy towards the lower part of our body. But what happened at that time, something very interesting, was unconsciously my eyes closed. And you made the comment, the goddess enjoys the senses, open your eyes and look. And that made me think, even in our actions with our body, we are very focused on intellectualizing it, looking at it from a mental space rather than a physical space. So we close our eyes and block out the senses so that we can then focus on them from a mental point of view and intellectualize them. And you also mentioned that the goddess tradition is a very much a physical aspect. It's a bodily, and I'm sure we'll talk more about that. But at the beginning, what I felt was separating the mind and the body, as you say, and then classifying the mind space to be patriarchal, masculine, and the body space to be feminine is something very interesting, I find, because it's the terms masculine and feminine have been used quite loosely, and today it comes into the context of male and female. But I think what you are speaking about is not essentially having a masculine mind and a feminine a male mind and a female body. You're talking about a much more intangible, a much more subtle sense of feminine and masculine. Am I correct in that understanding?
Sean, thank you. Yes, that's an important reflection. So the thing about an embodied tradition is that always bringing it into words is always problematic. And it was, even with Sanskrit, this was a problem. And it is only like compounded when we look at English, which, I always think that a language is made for a culture. Even when we say that English is an international language, it comes from a particular culture. It is made for a particular culture, a particular spirituality, and a particular set of values. So it's actually very challenging to talk about these practices, even in Sanskrit, but even more so in English. So there are multiple ways in which this masculine feminine works, and they're all equally valid. So we live in a time where more and more and more we want words to be pinned down. There should be no movement in a word. The word has to have a meaning, and that's it. And if it has any kind of ambiguity, then we'll start splitting it. Let's split it further. Let's see how we can get to that specificity where there is an absolute meaning and you can't do anything else with it. Now, that just doesn't work in terms of words in the goddess tradition. So for the male, the masculine and feminine, particularly the feminine, has multiple meanings and they are all equally valid. So on the one level, the body is feminine, and body or kshetra in the goddess is not just the body, but it is earth. The kshetra means the field. So a site, a field. So the earth is the field of manifestation, the sky, the cosmos, the body, it's all the same. So when you kind of sense body in the goddess, everything is the body. So that is feminine. That is feminine. So the earth is feminine, manifestation is feminine, the divinity is feminine. So what is the masculine then? So the masculine is talking about the energy of the mind or the mental consciousness. And this is the consciousness that is about separation, that is about label. In Sanskrit, there is a word called nama rupa. So nama, which name, and rupa, form. So the main quality of mind is to want to label everything, to categorize everything, and to give everything a very specific form. So this consciousness is what is referred to in originally it was called Purusha, which then became the male, the masculine, but it's all part of the goddess consciousness. It's not that this is separate. It's all part of the goddess consciousness. And in fact, in the Vedas, they talk about the 3/4 of the word is hidden in the cave. So the cave is one big space, and it's like the word is the doorway, but it's still part of the cave. So the body, the feminine, but in the goddess, the body is the body, a woman's body. The body that is capable of, has the potential to give birth, the body that menstruates, the body that has menopause. So in other words, a body that is non-linear, that experiences time as non-linear and as an embodied experience. And so the woman's body has this. It's inherent in the woman's body, this non-linearity. And non-linearity is a very important part of the practice of the goddess. So you see, it's many different things at the same time. It's a consciousness. The feminine is a consciousness. There is at another point also the goddess is the female body. So the signal of the goddess in reality, in manifested reality, is the female body.
I mean, you mentioned 3 points, so I noted down 3 points in that, in what you mentioned just now about language and the fact that language has to have a very specific meaning. And in addition to that, how it goes down a path of classification,
Yes.
Categorizing and classifying. And language as we see it is quite linear, or the language that we speak today, or the language that we are speaking now, for example, English, which is the lingua franca for all dominant knowledge systems in the world, particularly if we speak of science and technology, from the area that I look at knowledge from. And in that space, having a low context language like English, so we categorize languages quite loosely to high context languages and low context languages. And then you have a low context language like English, which expects all instructions to be explicitly stated, and there is no implied understanding hidden behind the words. And the fact that the post 1500s expansion into other cultures, particularly from the West and from Europe, have embarked on a mission of classifying, categorizing in the name of science, and as we see now in the name of economy and politics. And also the the linear narrative that this movement has progressed, sort of one thing leading to the next, which is always better than the previous, and then we move into something that is even better, and we have this grand vision to move to something even greater. So these 3 elements that I just picked up sort of contradict or work against the goddess tradition, and how the goddess tradition means it's not even a high context language from what I'm hearing you're saying. It's beyond language. It's beyond language, and there is no need to classify or label, because you accept everything as it is, and there is no linear tradition, because it is encompassing. It's chaos, essentially. It's chaos. And
To our mind, yes. Yeah.
yes, and that doesn't sit very comfortably with how we want to see the world, or what the mind wants to see the world as. So that's a conflict between the masculine and the feminine, not the male and the female, but the masculine and the feminine energies, as I see it. And in today's society, we have a very strong, I would say, a masculine energy dominating how we view the world. So goddess traditions and these views of non-linearity, non-classification, beyond language would not sit in that space quite easily. Is that a challenge, as you see, with moving forward with the goddess tradition? Or I should not say moving forward as well, because it is non-linear.
Yes. Sean, I think the goddess, the mind, is as ancient as the goddess. There is nothing really new about the mind. The goddess tradition is there because the mind was there. And they're both as old as each other. The nature of the mind consciousness, the nature of the goddess consciousness, they're both as ancient as each other. And they are there because the other exists. And the goddess traditions absolutely knew the nature of the mind, the behavior. Everything about this tradition knows exactly what are the paradigms of the mind. So time, linearity, like you said, past, present, future, accumulation, complexity, division, division into like the tribalism, or division into categories or classifying. Out of division comes everything else, competition, gain, profit or loss, always the focus on the outcome. Is it going to be a profit? Is it going to be a loss? And so these behaviors of the mind is completely embraced and recognized in the goddess practice. The whole practice is there because of this nature of the mind, the nature of the mind to divide. And the thing with division is that you can't choose about just dividing in one way. No. If you divide, that's your paradigm. You can't just say, I'm only tribal here, but I'm not there. But this division is, once you're there in that behavior, then you are divided. You're dividing yourself from the earth. You divide yourself from another person. You divide yourself from another community. So this divisive habit of the mind is well known. However, it is also part of reality. So the tradition is about how do you dance with these two consciousness? How do you dance with this mind, which has this particular drive? And how do you bring the mind with its strengths? The mind, the strength of the mind is the protective nature of the mind. You know, the ability, we do need to, you know, certain amount of functionality and, you know, being at that level. So, but how do you bring the mind along to its highest manifestation? In other words, to the divine masculine. So in the goddess tradition, at the doorway, there were these deities called Kshetrapalas. They were the male deities, you know, like Murugan, including even the ancestry of Shiva as Bhairava. They were the guardian deities of the goddess. But that didn't make them any lower, because remember, in the goddess, there's no hierarchy. So it's not like they are any lower. You need their protection. You need to invoke them. So the first thing you do in the practice is you invoke the Kshetrapalas. You ask for their protection, especially about fear, because the mind carries a lot of fear. Over centuries, we've told the mind what makes us feel secure. You can't blame the mind. You know, it has over centuries, we've told the mind we like comfort, we want safety, we want stability. And if we don't find all this, we are going to be afraid. So the mind is very careful about protecting you. And the minute you know, when you say, I want to go into the goddess practice, which is this space where there is, you know, it's not linear, it's non-linear, and you can't label, immediately there is fear. And so that's where these Kshetrapalas are invoked to protect us, to free us from fear, to be there fiercely. So the first practice of a goddess tradition, and this is there even now, you know, elements of it still are there now, is called the Vira, which is the heroic consciousness. And these Kshetrapalas are invoked for us to come into the heroic consciousness of the mind, which is that the divine masculine of the mind. And it is always, it's the union. So there, at a certain point, there is no division between Shiva and Shakti. And that is all, it's signified in the fact that they are united in their lovemaking. That uniting is happening in tenderness. It's not in animosity. It is not conquest one by the other, but it happens with utter love and tenderness. Yeah. And you're absolutely right about the fact that we live in a world that's dominated by mental paradigms. We disconnect ourselves from the earth. That's the first thing that happens. When you disconnect from the body, it's through the body that we can connect to the earth. And we disconnect ourselves from the earth, and you can see the impacts of that are you know, really tragic, not for the planet, but for us as humanity. I mean, the planet will endure because it's eternal. But for us as humanity, I mean, you know, what is eternity? Eternity is not something abstract. Eternity is the earth beneath us, which has been there for millions of years before us, will be there for millions of years after us. It's not an abstract philosophical concept. It's real. And our bodies are part of this earth. So eternity is a material experience in the body. It's not something abstract and conceptual or somewhere remote in some galaxy. It's here beneath us. We walk on it every day.
I mean, understanding it in that way makes it even more difficult for the mind, I think, because the mind is, as you said, working on this path of classifying, categorizing, and constructing conceptual mental borders. I mean, even the fact that we said this webinar starts from 7 to 8, it's a time concept, a construct that we have, so that there is no idea apart from the mind. There is no idea that exists that this should finish at this time and start at that, and it's a boundaries we have created.
Yes.
And this constant division, this path of division that we are going under, and separating ourselves from one another, but also at the same time from the earth. And by the earth I mean the entirety. It's quite a challenge. But what I am quite interested is, I mean, as much as the body knows the mind, and you spoke about the divine masculine, doesn't the mind know about the body? Is there a space where the mind could know about the body in the same way as the body knows about the mind?
Well, at the moment, the mind has conquered the body, isn't it?
That's true.
Yes, in the times we live in, like you were saying, the mind has conquered the body. So the body at the moment is enslaved to the mind, isn't it? What would you say, Sean?
I think that's an accurate observation, because I think we are talking about relationships here, and the way the body relates to the mind, as our conversations previously have been, it's a sensual relationship, it's an engaged relationship, it's Ardhinareshwara, it's the Shiva and Parvati coming together, it's Krishna and Radha coming together, all those entwined spaces, and where the boundaries completely blur, where one becomes the other and unrecognizably so. Whereas the way the mind relates to the body, is more on a divisive controlling paradigm.
Yes,
It's about conforming to certain things, fitting certain models,
yes,
and uh, and I go back to my previous point about how we language it in today's world. We are quite, I mean, climate control, managing the environment, natural resource managing, the sort of economics of the environment. We have these words that we have built into our language, how we speak about it, the narrative that we have today, and in that sense, so the relationship that the mind is taking towards the body is from I think it's not the same. It's a very different relationship, and as a result, there is conflict because
yes.
one is trying to approach it in a more embrace one is trying to embrace it, whereas the other is trying to sort of say no, it has to be in this particular way.
Yes.
So um, there is going to be conflict in that space. That's what I think.
Yes, well, the conflict is because the mind, like just as you said, the mind, mastery is a paradigm of the mind. So mastery, conquest, controlling, capturing. So this is inevitable in the mind. There is no way the mind can go into nonlinearity, into that kind of, what can I say, blurring. I always say, let the colors flow into each other when we are practicing. And one thing I want to say, Sean, is just to ground this a bit here, because these are not just words. So in the goddess practice, just today in class, I was practicing with one of the women in my individual program. And we came to the practice of one of the doorway deities, which is Krodha Bhairava, which is one of the very ancient forms of Shiva, and the practice of Yakshi, which is the sensuality, the sensuousness practice, which is the heart of goddess, is pleasure and sensuousness. And so there was a moment where there was a particular practice of bringing these two together. So here's Krodha Bhairava, very ferocious, very masculine in embodiment. And then there is this Yakshi, which is, in the three bend position, very sensuous, sensual. And when the practice was happening, she felt absolute fear arising. Now, you could think, oh, these are just benign things. But these are things, they are things of the consciousness. And there was this, and she said, I'm actually sensing fear here. I'm sensing that something is happening which the mind is not able to control and label. And then it gets into fear. But the goddess actually knows, the goddess tradition actually knows that this will happen. And so the moments when these things happen, it can be fear or it can be resistance, it's called a baddha in the practice. And a baddha is a teaching moment. And there's the other teaching moment is what is called a siddhi. And a siddhi is an insight which comes from the practice, which is very intimately relevant to you, the person who's practicing. But in the very same time, it is universal. So these are the two teaching moments in the goddess, and they are both very intimate moments, but they're also universal. And so when the mind goes into this, there is no pushing through. We don't kind of put our fist through the wall because there is no mastery here. Mm-hmm. We are not going into what is the solution now. Now, I have to be able to do this. No, some other practice comes in, which might kind of spiral around or go under it. or we'll retreat from it. So it's not the solution of how are we now going to solve this? This is not happening in the body. So I'm going to stay here and keep on going brutally until it happens. That's not it. So it's not about, oh, I have failed because now I've retreated and gone somewhere else. That is exactly the practice. So there's so many ways in which there's no conflict from the goddess side is what I'm saying. Never. It is never that now, okay, you know what? I've come against this and I'm going to just, hit, what do they say? Knock heads against each other. Yeah. No. So it'll be a retreat, or it'll go around or spiral somewhere else. Because the Buddha is already a learning moment.
Hmm. And this is what you describe as the play.
The play, yes.
The play that goes on, the Leela that happens in the one thing I feel that, I mean, we are all energy. We are resonating at different frequencies, at different energy levels, and it's not the energy that we measure using scientific apparatus, but it's energy, and this energy does flow in different ways, and allowing that flow to happen rather than conforming it is. And I mean, going back to my own experiences in your classes, one thing that I still I find quite a challenge is when you say let go, let go. And it's that allowing that those learning experiences, opportunities to happen. Because I remember once we did a certain practice, and you said that just feel what is going to happen. It's free form. And you said traditionally this was the stamba position was sort of a pillar where you locate yourself, and you will be sort of, it comes from a place of fear. There can be a sort of a tremor. But what was happening with me was I was trying to understand those words in my mind and then try to manifest it in my body. So essentially what I was doing in that space was trying to understand it, the words, and then give those words form, and then express that form in my body. But what you're saying is that is not what is expected. What is expected is allowing fear to emerge in its own form in my body rather than conceptualizing it. Is that a way of putting it?
Well, that's I'm so glad you're speaking from, that embodied experience you've had, because, the thing with fear, so there is this deity called Kala Bhairava, and this is the deity that is associated with the rasa fear. But a deity of fear, what is that about? Because there is fear, fearsome. So think about a lion when it is being attacked. It's in great fear, but it's also at its most fearsome.
Right.
So this thing, now the mind, it cannot, how the mind can't bring that together.
Because the lion should be in a retreating mode if it's been attacked. So it's been fearsome doesn't make sense in that space, does it?
Yeah, but it is. When a lion is attacked, it's at its most fearsome. So this fluidity between fear and fearsome. And then it's about what is the energy that manifests when that happens. So then you move beyond the words. The problem is when you get stuck with the word, then you're stuck with the story of fear, and that's it. It's fear, then that's it. How can I find energy from that? But then, this is the dancing, this is the rasa. So it's not something personal. The personal is your story. I always say that, it's your story, it's your narratives. And yes, I'm not saying that's not important, but the practice is about how are you universal, not how are you an individual. But it's actually the truth that we are really not very individual. We are universal. Our mind is very universal. The goddess consciousness is in you. Otherwise, how come in many different parts of the world around the same time, there were these traditions which are very similar to incredible extent? So there are movements that in the dance that I sometimes see in rock paintings, for example, in Algeria, ancient rock paintings. And then, I know people then try to figure out, oh, did they have trade with each other? Did they connect with each? Because we just can't accept the fact that there is a consciousness in which we are all connected. We truly are connected. And this happens all the time when I practice it. So again, I want to ground it by saying that it happens all the time when I practice with women. So again, today, it happens all the time. Today I was, there's a woman in New Zealand with whom I'm practicing, and here we are on Zoom doing the class together. And she has this moment yesterday where she felt she had to review, she's been doing 3 months. So she had to review the things. So last night she sat there and she was looking at all our practice notes and reviewing. And you know what? The first thing I wanted to tell her when she came to class was we probably should be doing a bit of a review because we've now had 3 months. So, but these moments happen all the time, and there is guidance in the practice. Things will come in a dream to this person I'm working with, and I might have an intuition, and then we come together and okay, so that's the practice. So this is not something, a fantasy, this is not something sentimental. And I think the problem is we've made all these things a bit sentimental. There's a lot of fantasy about goddess traditions, a lot of it coming from, you and I've talked a lot about this, about, appropriations of Indian traditions. And, then it becomes a little bit of a fairy tale and a fantasy. And you lose the rigor and the truth of that consciousness experience, that it is something, it is a tradition, it's not just a fantasy. There is a tradition, there's a practice, and there were, ancient practices that actually absolutely knew how to do this. I don't know, Sean, what do you think?
No, I mean, the fact that goddess worship or the mother goddess worship is universal across all cultures and societies that have historic affiliations with divinity and looking at something beyond mere existence. So, and it comes from a space of nurturing, of a space of birthing, from a space of inception and coming into being. And so and we even had this conversation once. I was saying that the mother goddess or the goddess is more or less homogeneous across how she is worshipped, whereas the male gods who marry her in various forms do take on different forms or names based on the categorization the mind has assigned to them. So I completely agree with you on the fact that it's universal and it's very much grounded. It's a deep space then from which the divine feminine emerges. And I think what has happened, also going back to one of the previous points we just spoke about, was the movement since alternative thought emerged, particularly scientific or modern scientific thinking as it has emerged, and its purpose of removing all element of sentimentality, all element of emotion, even in its writing, in its form, how we write science. It's not an agental passive voice, for example. We don't bring the agent in, it's passive. We don't have any action in that space. And the mind rules that space. There is no space for thinking, feeling, the emotions to come into that space. So we are talking from a very artificial understanding of the world, or a very one-sided perception of the world, whereas the grounded, the deeper, the more universal aspect of the divine feminine is more pervasive. It's across all cultures. And even in the worshipping form of the divine feminine, it's sometimes, particularly in India, and I'm not that familiar in other cultures, but they are rudimentary forms. They would be rocks, trees, clay pots, places of emergence, inception, and so forth. So, I mean, you have a better understanding. You will definitely be able to enlighten us on this. So, do you think that the conceptualization of the divine feminine in these rudimentary forms is symbolic of the fact that she's grounded, that she's much more universal rather than the mental space than which we try to understand her by?
So lots there, Sean. Before I just want to reflect on, the mother goddess. And here again, this understanding of mother that we have come to in our mind-dominated culture, we have really kind of reduced this mother into something about fertility. And we've kind of neatly put all these goddesses in the corner and said, oh yes, they were agricultural societies, so fertility was important. And so they are fertility goddesses. See, this is the amazing thing of labeling things. It's interesting. There's a philosopher called Peter Kingsley who writes about, we always think that spirituality comes from a social, there is first a society and then the spirituality comes from that, there's an agricultural society, so then the spirituality comes out of that. But the fact that a spiritual revelation can be the source of civilization, we just can't get our minds around that. That spiritual revolution, the spiritual revelation, so the spirituality can actually be the source of a civilization, can actually be not just the source of the beginning of a civilization, but the trajectory of it. And the more we go away from that source, from that spiritual source, if we don't recognize how that is the source, we get to where we are now. Because we think everything is mechanistic, as Vandana Shiva says, the mechanistic mind, everything is mechanical. And so we end up where we are today. And so why am I saying that is because the mother, the goddess as the birthing, the goddess as the source of birth, is also about the birthing of your full consciousness. So this is a birthing of our consciousness, is an endeavor in the moment all the time, because there's a constant dancing. And that's why dance was the language of the goddess, because it is an ongoingness. It is something that is, dance is, of all the art forms, dance is very transient. It's in the moment. It's not like even like a painting or a sculpture that you can see, or a text, but dance is very much in the moment. And so this dance of birthing the consciousness, it happens all the time because the mind is present all the time. You can't just say, I'm now enlightened, I've got a certificate of enlightenment. I mean, that's the mind, because that's your, that doesn't exist, because the mind is, it's always this play going on. And so that's why there's importance of birthing, giving birth, that birthing. And that process is as visceral as childbirth. And that's the other invitation. Everything in the goddess is material. It is not conceptual, it's not symbolic, it's not abstract. It's that physical process is like childbirth, in that your body is taken by that birthing, by that, just as when you give birth, your body is taken, the waters break, something emerges. It's the same thing viscerally. It is an embodied experience. It is not an experience of the intellect or the mind or of anything, remote outside of the body. It's a deeply visceral experience. So this was this attachment of the goddess to the body, the woman's body. Yes. And reducing it to just fertility. I'm not saying, of course, there are connections to fertility, and that has continued even today. A lot of this has become around the fertility, but we're forgetting, we kind of get reduced to the fertility, and we forget that expansiveness of where does that connection go, what does that fertility expand into, we forget. So this, so it's important to sort of say that, because I feel like, all of these things have been dismissed as, oh, they're just fertility cults, and that word cult, they're fertility cults, and therefore they can be marginalized and disregarded. I don't know what you made another point, which I've now forgotten.
The representation of the goddess that is coming in rudimentary forms. So yes. And I think I will add on to that, because you spoke of the non-linear in these spaces, and how we assume that a hunter-gatherer society has to will have certain religious or worshiping practices, but then they will become more civilized and move on to an agricultural society. And in such a space, because of the free time available, there will be deeper thinking on philosophy and where we come from and so forth, and then religion is born. But I think these paradigms have been turned on their head with modern findings like Gobekli Tepe, for example,
Yes.
which questions and really bamboozles archaeologists to think of an archaeological site which has been built with people coming together and in a pre-agricultural society, when we assume that our ancestors were hunter-gatherers. So religion, organized religion, did exist at that time, and it and what I'm trying to say here is that um, it's not possible to understand uh, this complex thinking of, as you said, emerging just from a society coming together. It can be individuals thinking. It can be how people their experiences. So it doesn't have to be a place where they have. It's an agricultural society. So, for example, we speak of fertility in that space, but because the that is the paradigm. The ground will yield food and so forth. So. Uh, yeah, so I mean, I'm rambling here, but what I'm trying to say is, I completely agree with what you're saying in terms of we can't have these linear discourses when it comes to religion, and particularly classifying the goddess. And it'll be interesting whether we will, I mean, we will move from mother goddess to another version of the goddess in today's society, because is fertility an issue anymore for us? That's, yeah. So sorry, so many points that I brought there.
Yeah, no, I agree. And I think one of the things is that the goddess is, always alive. Again, so she's not a story. You bring up an interesting point about, so what is, really what you're speaking about is what is the relationship of this practice to history, to the past. How is it current? What does it mean in our times? I mean, beautiful observations, Sean. And central to the practice in India, and it's still there in the philosophy of India, even though I don't think people actually kind of really in their bodies feel what it is it was always this direct experience, the direct experience, direct perception. And it was that relationship of your body, your being, to the divine, to the whatever you're calling. So in the goddess, it's always the calling of, you're calling the goddess. You're not becoming the goddess, because what are you becoming? The becoming is a story. If you say I've become Kali, okay, what is Kali then? That's a story about Kali. But it's the calling. And you can see that this calling is, you can see it in the Sufi traditions, you can see it in the Bhakti traditions, this calling with yearning, with love. And so you're calling the goddess is calling you. And this calling is not historical, because there's no story. All the elements of the goddess, like the stone, like the tree, and here's why it isn't attached to time, because the goddess is the earth. Everything about the goddess is eternal. It's the earth, it's the stone, it's the mountain, it's the tree, it's the bird song, it's the forest. And why the pot? Because the pot is made of earth, water, and fire, elemental. It's elemental. The pot, and what the pot? The pot is the womb, not the fertility womb, but the womb which is the source and which is the return. The great womb, of reality, consciousness from where we emerge, or the cave. The cave is the womb. So the cave is another goddess signal. And I don't say symbol, because I say signal, because there's a materiality there. And when we dance, all these practices become embodied, and all these signals become embodied practices. So what is the mountain practice? For example, in Durga, where, this is what I'm teaching this term, and there is this mountain practice. And it's the practice of spreading spreading at the base into the earth. So you're moving, opening, and pulling the earth up to rise. That is Durga. It's not rising and floating, but you only rise by bringing the earth into your body, just like the mountain does. The mountain connects the sky and the earth. So the mountain is non-linearity. It's the signal of non-linearity. And it connects the sky and the earth by bringing the earth up, not by leaving the earth and flying up. So, these become, every single one of this, the Yakshi practice is very related to the trees. The stone, the stamba practice. And those big pillars that were built, there are many pillars even in India. The stamba is a real signal, but it's only makes meaning when you embody it. So what is this? The stamba, again, that's standing your ground. You standing that ground in the middle of all that swirling. In every moment, you find your ground. And that is an ongoing practice. You can't just stand your ground and then, just say, well, I don't care what's going on. In every moment, you've got to find that stamba. So it's a dance, that movement into stamba each moment. So all these also become embodied practices. And the practice, the dance, is the philosophy. So there's no text, but the dance is the library of philosophy of the goddess, is the dance.
And it's a very embodied practice because, and again, I would say it's also a very individualistic, it's personal, and it can't be, and it can't be language, it can't be put into words, because my words or my experience, or again, going back to a previous point, words in a culture image based on the experience, or the words having a concept to be expressed with that word. So my word for fear is very different from your, even if you use the word fear, how you understand fear. So it's a very individual practice. It's a very personal experience. So moving to convert it into language can defeat its purpose, and try to sort of homogenize it, trying to bring it into sort of a form that many people would relate to. But then in doing so, it takes away the very essence of that philosophy which is one that is individualistic, which should be experienced on their own. I mean, when we speak of dance, we do assume that there is a certain set dictates. People perform in a certain way. They would dance and there would be a certain action. But what you are saying is that is not what it is. Dance is a much more deeper. It's a process that you move into a deeper space and try to locate that solidarity inside you, and then have experiences around that, grounding it. I mean, do you think therefore we have to
you're better at putting all this into words, so I'm listening.
should we redefine dance in that sense? Sort of, should we because I think the English word dance would sort of, it indicates choreography, movement, things in the, should we, I wonder, because I wonder whether using the word dance for this space takes away its very essence, because it's much deeper than that. And I mean, that's my experience, and that's what you have shared as well.
Well, Sean, I feel, I'm a great lover of plurality, because, practicing the goddess for a long time, she loves plurality. Yeah. So plurality doesn't mean, the mind actually has a problem with plurality. So that's why it wants to label, categorize, and, kind of arrange everything. In the goddess space, everything's okay, everything. So I really love the fact that there are many different kinds of dances, and, and they're all meaningful, because I think what is it's about the intent. And here we come to another very, probably the most important aspect of goddess is, what is your intention? Why are you here? Why are you dancing? And if you're dancing, to become a dancer, to have dance as a hobby, to perform, beautiful. I mean, it's so much better than so many other things we do. It's so much more worthwhile. And dance as a beautiful, uh, expression, self-expression, dance as therapy, it's everything is fine. I think the clarification is, why are you here? If you're here to call the goddess, if you're here because the goddess, something about the goddess resonates, if you're here because you feel like there is a yearning in you, particularly for women, there's this yearning that, it's about this awareness of something more expansive in you, something that is more expansive, something that can connect you to something elemental, then this is the practice. This is the dance. This is the practice. But in the same way that this dance is not for performing, it's not, we still use choreography in some of the classes, not in the individual program so much, but it's not about the performance. It's not about therapy. It's not about self-expression. Because within this tradition, the self is a story. Everything's a story. Even what is today. Yesterday I was practicing, one particular practice with one of the individual women I was working with, and in that practice, it's that even the self, the human, is a story. What is a human being is a story. And the way in the practice it happens is that you bring up all the sensations, the rasa. So I'm not talking, the reason why I use sensation and rasa is feeling, that psychological feeling level is still within that story of the self and the psychology. And that is very important because, like I said, all these layers exist. It's not, you don't say the psychological self doesn't exist, but it's not the only thing. I mean, for the mind, it says this is the only thing.
Yes.
But the goddess says it's there and there's more. That is the thing. There's more. There's more. And so, so the bringing up of the rasa completely into the face. And when you bring it up into the face, you consider the face not as this thing that we all know. I mean, the face is, almost like the stamp of the personhood, isn't it? The face.
Yes.
But you think of all the different parts of your face as like your parts of the body, the eyebrows, the eyes, the nose, your mouth, they all have movement. And then you're no longer, the woman has worked with me, she said, oh, I don't feel like a human. Because then you're coming to the point where you're kind of inquiring into what is the story of the human. It's beautiful because that's the expansion. And why is this important is because when you hold all these things with such an inclusive, open way, you're not competing, you're not fighting, you're not kind of dividing. I mean, we're so divided now, Sean, don't you think? We're so divided. Yeah. And the whole thing of the goddess is we are all elements. We're made of elements. And we are the earth, so it's about can we think of what connects us rather than what is dividing. And so we're all the time now we're talking about what's dividing us, isn't it? Don't you feel that?
I agree. I mean, if you look at a few, we don't have to go quite far back in time, and just maybe a decade or two ago, the sciences that we have now, which are so specific in their investigations. So you would have, I mean, 20 years ago, there would have been botany and zoology that looked at animals and plants. But now we have evolutionary genetics. We will have nanotechnology, molecular biology, very, very specific areas. So the way that we have looked into the natural world has divided so much. And the same way when I look at language, we have words that help us to identify very specific emotions, almost as they are discrete, and which is, we know through experience that emotions don't come across as an individual experience. They are often entwined, they are mixed. So we are in a very, not only are we in a divisive world with our physical aspects, but also the non-tangible. We are very keen on dividing, on categorizing. Yeah, so
Yes, and fixing and defining, like, you know, um, there is a poem by T.S. Eliot. I'm sure it's, yes, I think it's T.S. Eliot, and I never forget this. You know, the poem had this imagery of, I think it was a butterfly that, you know, is anesthetized and pinned. And it was this enduring image for me. And that's what I feel about how we are trying to kind of just, and in that pinning, it's almost like we kill it. You know, it's this dead insect, but it's beautifully spread out in the wings and then it's pinned, but it's actually, you know, it's actually sort of dead. And I feel like there is a deadening that happens when you start, you know, kind of losing any ambiguity, losing any mystery. You know, we don't like mystery. We always, or we make, and I do want to touch on that, you know, this, because when you mentioned about the mind not liking sentimentality, I think you meant, and I was meant to say something about it. In fact, the mind is very sentimental.
okay.
You know, if you look at something I always think is, you know, you look at the way Facebook algorithms behave, it's got the nature of the mind down to an absolute art. You know, it's like it knows everything about, whoever's working at Facebook knows the mind very, very well. and so you can see, you know, and in Durga, there are these four traits of the mind, and you can see all of them in Facebook. One is sentimentality, you know, all those beautiful puppy dog things that keep coming, you know, we absolutely addicted to it. The mind just goes, and, you know, I have to work very hard, not looking at that. Yeah. So these, you know, all these cute puppy dog things that keep coming, sentimentality. The other is this flailing around, this anxiety of the mind, you know, constantly flailing around. The third is emptiness of words. Again, Facebook, you know, words. You know, spirituality has become a Facebook post now. You know, everybody has Facebook posts. And then the other one is about Durdara, Durmukha, you know, Madhu, which is that sentimentality, and Kaita, which is about tribalism, category, you know, methodology. And you see all these four clearly being, you know, power of Facebook is because it absolutely harnesses these traits of the mind and then goes for it. And we just fall for it because, you know, the mind is just, you know, conquered by those kind of mechanisms. So I was just thinking it's 8 o'clock now. And Sean, do you think we can open it up for some questions?
I think that would be a good idea, Padma.
Okay, so Priyanka, over to you.
Oh, thanks, Sean and Padma. I'd lost track of time. I'm glad someone was keeping track of it. I mean, that was a fascinating discussion, and you know, there are questions in Q&A, but I just had a few to start off with. And I think, you know, one of the themes, enduring themes that we keep coming back to is this concept of time. And how, you know, like we've discussed, it is a construct of our mind. And, you know, Padma, you touched on it briefly around, you know, eternity is the earth. You know, it's what's around you. And that is where the goddess practice emerges from. So in a sense, you know, we try and honor it through dance, etc. But, you know, I think there are elements of this you've touched on before, Padma, but, you know, can you highlight a bit more about how do you bring those eternal elements into your, you know, into your daily living? Like, you know, how do you make it a part of your daily life so that, you know, it gives you sort of that anchor point away from, you know, the chaos of mind and time, you know, like we said, that's the construct of the world today. That's where we live in. So how can those things help us? How can they help ground us?
Well, that's a great question, Priyanka, because, you know, in the end, we all want something that is going to translate into our daily lives, right? And this dance is very much about that. So, you know, all the practice, you know, that in class, it's always about how can this help you in your day-to-day life? And one of the simple things, and I actually shared a video about this practice, is particularly in these times, I just find it beautiful is simply lying on the earth. and not just lying limply. Yeah, so it's not a shavasana, it's not like lying relaxed, but actually pressing yourself into the earth. So when you lie down, it's very simple. Anyone can do it. You lie down on the earth, on your back, chin in, at back of your neck long, and you just gently press yourself. Put your heels, flex your heels and press yourself. This is a very ancient practice, by the way. It was, I know, I've read about it in the Greek tradition. I've read about it in the Anatolian tradition, that women doing this from very ancient times. And in fact, apparently they even do it now, just lying on the earth and pressing into the earth. And what happens when you press is you literally feel like you are that soil pressed into the earth. And I'm telling you, this is not imagination. And you lie there and you look, your gaze changes because you have the sky all around you. And those myths about the sky falling into the earth to make love to the earth, it's like, that's the sensation. And truly, there is an expansiveness, an embrace, an acceptance. When we talk about the abundance of the earth, no use using words. And this is where I say no sentimentality. Sentimentality is when you don't put body in it. So put the body, and this is a simple practice. But even listening to bird song is another thing. Listening to bird song, and don't listen to it and say, oh, this is a magpie, or oh, that is that, because that's the mind labeling. Oh, which is that bird? And that's the end. It's the end of our visceral connection. But just listening to bird song without even trying to figure out which bird, not even looking for the bird. I just feel so grateful that even today I can get up. I live in, I don't, it's not very suburban here, but I'm not, out in the bush. I feel so grateful that I can hear the birds when I wake up every morning, just the birds, and just listen to them. Don't want to understand them. And, listening to bird song is, again, bird song is very important in goddess traditions across the world. Goddesses are associated with birds from ancient times. Some of them have bird faces. And, the language of the birds, that in Persian traditions, even language of the birds. And this is it, because it does something to the mind when you're listening to the sounds that you don't know the meaning. In fact, you won't even be looking for a meaning. You just listen to it as sound. Yeah. So these are simple things. Looking at a tree and just feeling like the body as a tree. The tree, we are like trees that are on this earth. We are just an event, just like the tree. Why do we think we're special? If a tree is there, we are there. So does the tree worry about what's my purpose in life and why am I here? Sometimes it's just nice to I sometimes think, just like, when I stand next to a tree, the yakshis were associated with trees. Little, just simple things like that. But I suppose in all this, what's coming up is the importance of nature and wilderness. And, the philosopher Stephen Jenkinson wrote about the wilderness is not important just because of sustainability. It's important for us for our humanity, because it's the source of our consciousness. And for us to remain human, the wilderness is important. Sean, I remember you saying something about this wilderness. Do you want to say something? Remember that I remember you saying something beautiful about that once.
I think it was about the Lyceum garden. Is that what? Yeah. So
no, you were talking about this that boundary between the village and the wilderness.
One of the sort of philosophical points of discussion between wilderness and the garden. So a village, for example, if you take a village, would have had a jungle, a wilderness, a bush around it, and then you'd have tamed that area to make it into an agricultural land in a garden. So this garden area has to always be maintained. It's a human space. But at any moment the wilderness can take over, whereas the wilderness is an unbridled, it's a space that that had no constraint over it. And I think we were talking about in the context of the Lyceum garden, where it was a garden by the wilderness, and philosophers would ponder the wildness, the unbridledness of the wilderness versus the garden, this strip of land that was cultivated and controlled, and the play that happened in that space. So it's very much one of those uh, intersectional, those cross, not a boundary, I would not call it a boundary, but one of those places where play happened.
Yes.
Yeah, yes, and
Yeah.
I think we were talking about the Grama Devatavis that emerged in these spaces as well,
Yes.
Padma.
Yes. The goddess being brought from the forest to the boundaries of the village. Yeah. Yes, absolutely. So that transition, that space is in between, the boundary between the forest and the settlement, the village. But Priyanka, I'm thinking even the play that we do, the play practice, just finding a sense of play, game, because that's, yeah, just that being that alertness and that curiosity and adventure, bringing that sense of play into life, which we think play is very bad, and that means you're not taking life seriously, and what's the profit in play, what's the productivity. Yeah, so just kind of being in play sometimes.
Oh, thanks, Padma. Thanks, Sean. And I'll take another question. This one's from the Q&A chat. I suppose you've addressed a bit of it, but can you share more about the goddess practice and forms linked to different goddesses?
Yeah, sure. So so the goddess practice, like I said, it's very ancient, and in my practice, I find a lot of connections to the dance in the Natya Shastra, which is this ancient text, and the practice it really follows a very traditional, very ancient kind of structure. I use this word, but it's very fluid, the structure. There's it's a kind of a spiral. So, but for the sake of conversation, and there is the structure which starts as the first thing we do is really the play, lila. Everything is approached through that playfulness, through that sense of presence, adventure, openness. Then we have the a Vira practice, which is the practice of the heroic, like I said. So this is a point where we start invoking the divine masculine deities, and each goddess will have their particular masculine deities. So what is the purpose of these many different goddesses? It's not because there are many different goddess consciousness, of course not, but these are like different doorways. So for example, if you have Kali, you can have Matangi. I'm talking about the more ancient goddesses rather than the modern ones. So Matangi or Kali or Aditi. So each of these goddesses has a particular constellation, and we are called to them. In fact, I always say you don't choose the goddess chooses you. We are called to them depending on our own consciousness and what's going on around us. So they are like little doorways. If the goddess is the cave, they are like the doorways. So depending on where you are, you can come through that doorway. But the goddess is all the same. Yeah, so there are overlapping practices sometimes between the goddesses. So each goddess will have a particular guardian at the door. So for example, for Aditi, it's Murugan, or Skanda or Kartikeya, that particular deity. And then you have a number of different kind of practices or goddesses that kind of bridge you from this mental consciousness, the goddess consciousness. They kind of work on bringing them together. So for example, the Yakshi practice. The Yakshi practice is really one of the very important goddess practices, because Yakshi is about the confluence of energy, ferocity, and sensuality, pleasure. And these are, pleasure, ferocity and pleasure, they are the two big sensations in goddess traditions across the world. And they can be storied differently, they can have different names for it, but these are, they can be called desire and something else. But these two things, pleasure and ferocity, they are fundamental to the goddess consciousness. And so Yakshi, the practice of Yakshi, it's a very deep practice. And that is about, and Yakshis are associated with trees, as I said, with the earth, with water. And there's, in all of this, there is at every point connection to something really elemental. It's because everything is made of sensation. The earth, the mountain, the river, the thunderstorm, a forest fire, everything is sensation. And we are made of sensation. And this, in Sankhya, which came from many of these goddess traditions, it's called gunas. The reality is colored with sensation. And so our consciousness is colored with sensation. And then we have these different practices to bring us from our limited kind of story and our kind of limited feeling, that separation we have, into that, coming into that expansion.
Yeah.
That limitlessness. And so, when you talk about the different forms of the goddess, I was mentioning some of them. So, for example, there's Kali, and in Kali, there is the sensuousness, but possibly, there's more kind of emphasis on the ferocity, on that aspect of the unknown mystery. If you go to Aditi, there is much more focus on the Yakshi element, but the connection of Yakshi. The Yakshi is a particular practice because it really connects back to the elemental nature of sensuality, ferocity. And so Aditi is much more about that, much more goes towards the elemental nature. Then you can have Matangi, which is the forest, the practice of the forest. And Matangi is connected to other goddesses like Valli, for example. So there is that connection, again, the forest consciousness. So they are differently, they have nuances, and they have different sensations. So again, it depends on which goddess is calling you. And that will depend on you, where you are, and also on what's going on around you, because we're not separate to the consciousness that's going on around us.
I think, Sean touched a bit on this. It's, there's there's the rich experience of experiencing something with sensations that come, and then trying to reduce it through language, and how that can actually be a reductive process. And, how, for instance, the word dance, like it communicates in, English that it's, this kind of an experience. But, when we talk about dance, like you mentioned, Padma, it's that expansiveness and, experiencing all this because you're going into your body. So there is that sort of dichotomy, I suppose, as well.
Sean, I don't know, do you have any reflection on that?
When we speak about dance, language, and particularly, like I mentioned, the language that we use is quite a low context reductionist language. So each word has to have a very specific meaning, and again, it dilutes. It has taken the word dance to a meaning of it's about physical movement, but what we were speaking about, what Padma was explaining, has a much more grounded, a deeper sense than just moving the body. That's where I was coming from. So yes, perhaps we need to sort of language it differently, or but again, that's
yeah, well, it's interesting. Like I said, the intention is everything. And Priyanka, maybe going back to your question, that's an important thing, is the intention here. And the one thing I didn't say even before the play is the yajna. And I'll be ending with that. But the yajna is the offering, the sense of your body, your consciousness as an offering to the practice. So you don't come to the practice with demands. So this is where the intention is everything. I would say that 90% of the practice is intention. And the practice only opens up when that intention is you're ready to offer. But that doesn't mean the practice won't be other things to you. There is no judgment here. You can come to the practice because you enjoy the dance. You can come to the practice for thing. But if you are coming to the practice, for example, if you're coming to the practice to say, I want a little bit of this to start my own business, I don't know whether you're going to get much value out of it. So the intention is everything. So this has happened, in a lot of the spiritual traditions from India were taken and they were commercialized in the West. They've been, they've been marketed, they've been branded, they've been commercialized, and that's fine. But the problem is that as a moksha practice, as a practice of unconditional freedom, which is moksha, is unconditional freedom, it can't kind of really work in those kind of commercial paradigms. It can work in other ways. You might have a good time. You might feel relaxed, and nothing wrong with all that. But the thing with moksha is it's unconditional freedom. You can't put conditions on it. You can't say, I want to have profit from this, or I want to kind of be a better CEO, or I want to make more money from this. That, because they are all conditional. I mean, if you don't make the money, then that's the end of your freedom. Yeah, so that moksha is unconditional freedom. And this is the practice. The practice is about unconditional freedom. And it asks a certain approach from you, from your being as well.
And I think that's a perfect segue, Padma, to what, I know we would all really appreciate is maybe ending this discussion on on that note of that practice. So, how do we, get into this unbound headspace more often?
Dance. Truly, I think less information, more embodied practice, but just making sure that whatever embodied practice you're doing, it's not mind sourced. So, sometimes we are doing embodied practices, but it's still the mind illustrating, the body illustrating the mind. Yeah. And so this is why this particular dance, which I won't go into it too much, but it's it's based on what is called karanas in the Natya Shastra, and these karanas were actually revealed movements. They were not created movements. They were not mind-sourced movements. They were revealed movements, and they are very particular kinds of movements, and so they are always a little bit about. Like the mind is always like, I can't really kind of control this, but that's the very purpose of those movements. So I suppose there are times when you are, particularly when you're in nature, that you can actually move out of your mind and really be in your body. And so don't always listen to podcasts when you're in nature. Just allow the bird song. Listen to the bird song, and without knowing, like I said, without knowing. So simple things. To allow the body to lead. The body is a vast intelligence. It's a vast consciousness. And truly, I feel like for our survival, for us to actually reconnect back with the earth, we have to change the paradigm. We have been going like this for thousands of years with this mind-dominated paradigms. And we still think the answer is going to be, I'm not saying throw it all out. I'm just saying, let it be led, or even at least start giving space to different paradigms. And it's not just Indian culture. Many traditional cultures across the world have very similar traditions. And it's just turning and listening to, these cultures that have been around for such a long time. We have them in our own country. One of the oldest living cultures in the world is in Australia. And listening also to how do they see reality? What is knowledge? What is the body? Let's not assume we know everything. We have defined what is knowledge. We have defined what is the body. What if we start opening it up again?
Thanks, Padma and Sean. That was definitely very interesting. I think we could continue here for a few more hours. But I know, Padma, you did want to close with a simple practice. So I'll hand over to you for that.
Yeah, let me just say thank you so much to everybody that has joined us today. I am privileged and honored. I always feel that the goddess calls those who need to be here. We are always here together in the heart space when she calls. And like I said to Sean, this was an unbound conversation because we just said whatever is needed to be said. And for those who are listening, for us, for those who are listening, it will be said. And so I hope that's true. And I hope that, your hearts are filled with the goddess. And so this little practice is what we do at the beginning and end of practices, and it is the offering. So we come in and we offer everything that we have been doing. Now, whatever we have spoken about the goddess, we have invoked her, and we do this for the good of everything, not just because we wanted information for our own good, but we do that so that in invoking her, we hope we do this because it's for the good of everything all around us. So just bring your hands together, so like you're holding a handful of flowers. Yeah, and we put into that all our thoughts, our demands, whatever information we think we've picked, the invoking of the goddess. We're not going to keep it for ourselves. Everything, and we offer it. So you just pour it through your fingers as if you're offering those flowers, and we offer it for the good of all life, every single form of life, and for the good of those who are governing us, so that they will be able to act for the good of all life. Because when we do that, we also have a life, we also have a future, and we also have harmony. And we also do this for the good of all the other people who are doing practices like this everywhere in the world. We also do that for the good, for their good, so that they may flourish and they may be able to share their practices with all of us. And so together with me, just say, this is how it is in the Natya Shastra, just say, so be it, so be it, so be it. So thank you so much. Sean, over to you.
Thank you, Padma. As always, it's such a pleasure to speak with you. Thank you, and I thank everyone for joining us today as well. And thank you, Priyanka, for facilitating this session. It's been a great privilege for me to be here. Thank you very much.
Yeah, and it's just to say, Sean, I absolutely thank you. It's an honor to be with you here. And I know we did this because we have our conversations, and we thought in the spirit of the offering, we thought here we are invoking the goddess, and perhaps we should be sharing it. So thank you, Sean. And Priyanka, I love your presence in our classes, such a beautiful mind, and such a beautiful person. Thank you so much.
Thank you both. And thank you everyone for joining us. I hope you've gained as much as I have from participating in this discussion. Please do feel free to write to Padma at info@movingarchetypes.com.au. The email address will appear on your screen as soon as we all log off. And please take these learnings into your life and into the rest of your evening. Thank you all so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.